All right, welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Deutschman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. I'm so pleased you could join us today as we kick off the Center's fall workshop series called Fellows in the Field. Today's interactive discussion focuses on building diverse and inclusive learning communities in a virtual world, and we are lucky to have two outstanding experts to guide us. Lara Schwartz is a professional lecturer at American University School of Public Affairs, as well as the director of the Project on Civil Discourse, also at American. Andrea Brenner is a sociologist, a former professor, and a college transitions educator. Andrea and Lara are the authors of How to College, What to Know Before You Go, and When You're There. I am proud to share that Lara and Andrea are recent graduates of the Center's 2019-20 Fellows Program, where they spent a year working on their project, Let Freedom and Respect Ring, Fostering Civil Discourse and Free Speech in the Classroom and Beyond. The link to the written material and videos that they created, along with a full recording of today's session, will be included in the event recap email. The chat, Q&A, and hand raise functions are all available, so please feel free to participate in this session by posing questions and comments throughout our time together. And now I turn it over to our experts.
Hi everyone, I'm Lara Schwartz. I am, as Michelle said, I'm a teacher at American University School of Public Affairs, where I founded and direct the Project on Civil Discourse. And Andrea, do you want to do your hello?
Sure, I'm Andrea Brenner, and I was a professor at American University for 20-something years. And I also created and directed the first year experience program at American University. I'm a sociologist and I am a first year experience educator.
Our project that we did with our fellowship with the UC Free Speech Center focuses on building classroom communities where free speech and civil discourse thrive, where people are respectful and inquiring. And our presentation today is along those lines in the virtual world. What we have for you today is 4 themes. Increasing commitment to community and online interactions with students, handling hot button moments in virtual educational environments, decreasing barriers to learning through universal design, and creating online spaces for student support during the pandemic. Now, one thing about our work is that what it's premised on, and I think this will resonate with many of our colleagues who work with students, whether as staff or as faculty, is that making space for people to be able to trust, communicate, listen, and share is a big deal. And it's a piece of the picture that's not always discussed in, for example, campus free speech programs, which are very vital and important, that focus on, for example, the rules relating to the First Amendment, harassment, Title IX, et cetera. So what we're hoping to do is share from our experience and our research ways to make your space a community space where these great conversations can happen. And so I'll kick that off with increasing commitment to community and online interactions with students. So my first piece of advice on increasing commitment to community is do it. When students perceive themselves to have a shared identity and a shared purpose in a classroom or a program, they can have hard conversations and they'll also engage more. And one of the things that I found in teaching online this semester and the second half of last semester is that some of these tools that I'm going to share are ways of really deepening engagement in the course and engagement in the sense of what we're doing. So the very first thing that I do, whether I'm in person or online, is lay the groundwork with language. I often don't refer to students as you. I will say you when there's a due date for an assignment that they have to write and I don't. But I generally refer to the whole class as we. We will be exploring ideas. We will be engaging with these learning objectives. And I make very clear that I'm interested in their contributions to my understanding of the topics as well. I do like to get students speaking with one another and engaging with one another's ideas. And in my classrooms, I have a rule in person and online that I'm not going to call on someone who puts their hand up while their colleague is speaking. What I want is for them to listen and then respond. But when I do ask someone to engage with what someone else has said, I don't just do generic him or her. I say, you know, your colleague or our colleague has made the following point. What do you think of that? And I encourage students to do the same, to see themselves as colleagues and refer to themselves as colleagues and normalize my doing so. The second one that I've found has been very well received, more particularly since moving to online, has been creating micro communities. So most of us who have taught or run programs in person know that turn and talk or pair and share type activities can be excellent, particularly in elevating some of the quieter voices in the room. And that remains true online. But what I found online, as our students are so distant from one another, they're literally in different spaces, and there are very few things that they can look to that hold them together as a campus, that creating communities of not just, okay, I'm sending you to a breakout room, but you are a member of a group that will work together across the semester, has been really successful. So what I did last semester, you'll see in this slide, I turned as we pivoted online, I assigned my students to 6 groups that I gave silly names like Collaborative Discussion Cabal, CDC, or Pandemic Memes for Mildly Amused Teens, and assign them into, and I'll say that if you do something like that and give them group names, offer them the opportunity to rename their own group, which can in itself actually be an exercise in building community. My students last semester kept these names. And what you see, I've removed their names, but I left it to them to determine how they would meet. This semester, I've created micro communities that will last the entire semester and have shared purpose, such as doing a full semester group project that they continue to add to all semester, or serving in a student mini law firm in my constitutional law course. And I've even assigned each group a mentor to further solidify that they are, a community. Define and assess engagement broadly and collaboratively. So another way to really emphasize that students are a member of a community is to emphasize in your, for instance, class participation or course completion rubrics or standards that you have, some of the community behaviors that can be, that you want to see, such as peer critiquing a friend's paper, helping someone else understand, listening respectfully. And so, you know, if you include in what you assess and what you constitute engagement, some of these collaborative skills, you're reinforcing this commitment to community. A lot of us dread group projects. I do them in every class, and I do put up sort of guardrails to stop them from going off the rails, such as having students assess themselves on their work as colleagues. They self-assess whether they would work with, whether they believe their group members would want to work with them again, and whether they would want to work with their group members again. But I also create opportunities for group problem solving in almost every class. So this is an example of not just a group project that might be one of the things that you turn in and are graded on, but an approach to an asynchronous class meeting. So what I do is my students in my constitutional law course who are in mini law firms, and you see these legal teams, I'm not disclosing student names, those are the names of their adult non-student attorney mentors. For an asynchronous course, I gave them a legal problem and I assigned the legal teams to take a specific side of the problem and argue onto the Blackboard discussion, basically what amounts to a legal opening statement, an appellate statement of how the case should come out. So this is specific to my field of law. Now tomorrow in class, I'll reincorporate this into our full Zoom meeting by taking what they shared on Blackboard and turning it into an interactive an interactive classroom discussion where we kind of deeply interrogate the things that they posted and the initial arguments that they made and allow the law firms to defend them. Finally, for this little piece, we did get an advanced question, which I really appreciated. How best can we introduce contemporary issues that have political resonance? For example, histories of structural injustice like redlining or voter suppression, and still maintain an environment such that students feel they can share their thoughts or personal experiences. And my short answer, but we can do more in the Q&A, is lay the groundwork first, the things that I said about building a community and trust and getting students a sense of their shared identity as members of a problem-solving and inquiring unit. Tie these things to learning or program objectives. So if you wish to speak about yesterday's grand jury verdict in Kentucky, find a way to analyze it and address it from the standards of your discipline or from the goals and purposes of your course. And shift from debate to collaborative problem solving. Give the students a question: how would we, as building our own society, address this challenge? And use communication methods that that I'll actually not go into too far, because I think Andrea's piece on hot moments really hits this, but I'm just previewing it as one of the answers. And I'll turn to Andrea.
Sorry about that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about handling hot button moments in virtual educational environments. Slide. So teaching inclusively embraces the many diversities of our students. And of course, we all know that includes race, ethnicity, gender identity, gender itself, socioeconomic status, first-gen status, disability status, et cetera, et cetera. And these diversity demographics and the personal experiences our students bring to our college classrooms provide potential for much more nuanced and interesting and exciting class discussions. But of course, they also provide challenges to us as instructors. So ideally, when we are making decisions related to our teaching, we should really be asking ourselves if any of our students will be disenfranchised by our choices. Slide. So there is a dramatic difference between speaking our truth and speaking the truth. And I'm sure we all know that. This is a lesson that we need to embrace in ourselves and in our teaching, but it's also one that I believe we should actively be teaching our students. Should we encourage our students to confidently share their own stories if they are willing to do so? Yes, of course, it's part of the learning process in a college classroom, but it's also our job as faculty members to remind our students to speak only for themselves, not for a larger group in which they are a member, and certainly not for a group in which they are not a member. As professors, we should also be modeling the importance of asking about the experiences of others, and sometimes that includes asking first if we can ask questions. Posing honest questions of others is really the clearest and the easiest and most honest way of learning about another individual's thoughts, emotions, and lived experiences. Slide. So I'm going to tell you that it's imperative to identify techniques to interrupt bias and discriminatory language in a classroom and learning environment. But it's not always easy to do. So let's talk a little bit of what that means. Inclusive teaching includes holding ourselves and our students accountable for the words and the opinions that they share, as well as teaching our students to hold themselves and their peers accountable for the language as well. So both conflicts between individuals sharing dissenting opinions in a classroom or the use of offensive language by a student are to be expected. That's part of the learning process. And although they're often uncomfortable, these incidents are really an appropriate part of college level learning. So I would say if we can manage these incidents well, they can be an excellent way for students to grow and also for us to grow as instructors. Slide. So what are hot button moments? So first, it's important to ask ourselves why so many of us are actually uncomfortable in the presence of a person experiencing a high level of emotional intensity in a classroom setting. And as faculty, if we think about it, we really want our students to be passionate and we want our students to be engaged. And we're even disappointed when they appear checked out, especially in video chat. So what is it really that scares scares us? And I think that's an important question we need to ask ourselves as faculty members. We also need to question what our reaction is when we hear a student say something that might be hurtful or discriminatory to a peer or to us or to a specific group of people. So facilitating inclusive classroom discussion means that we've thought about some of these possible classroom scenarios and we have a plan to interrupt bias and move forward. Slide. So inclusive classrooms really require faculty to educate ourselves on the classroom biases reported by students on our campuses, especially students who feel marginalized on those campuses. And this, of course, includes microaggressions. We must remember as faculty that a learning environment where a student perceives it to be hostile can dramatically and, of course, negatively affect their ability to learn and to thrive on campus. And we can be a part of changing that. Slide. So we must familiarize ourselves with at least one workable plan for interrupting bias in our classrooms. I would strongly suggest that. I would also remind you and myself as faculty members that each class we have different groups of students that work differently together. So different classes might require different plans based on the students who are enrolled. So ask yourselves, do you have a plan to respond if a student in your class makes a sexist, racist, or homophobic remark? I mean, do you have a plan in place? Are you ready to act quickly to provide a teachable moment so that communication doesn't shut down? These can be some of the most difficult and some of the most important teaching moments of any semester. I have found with my own experiences and with that of others, handling it wrong or not handling it all, and our authority in the class can be significantly compromised. Handle it appropriately, and we often model an appropriate response in a profoundly meaningful manner. Slide. So the goal here is to remember to open as many clear lines of communication as possible and limit our barriers to understanding. So our choice of words and our choice of actions when we find ourselves in an escalating conflict is really, really important. Of course, this is made all the more challenging when our classrooms are virtual. The telltale signs of eye rolling or shifting in seats, that's something that's so helpful to a faculty member to see that something is off, are not always quite as visible in an online classroom. So slide, I'm going to present to you a 5-step plan for interrupting bias in our classrooms. So keep in mind, many colleges and universities have already created these plans. You may have them on your campus. What I've done is sort of a compilation of many different universities' plans that seem to work well with faculty trainings. So it's a user-friendly resource. And of course, I'm going to discuss each one of these in detail. As Lara mentioned earlier, we did have some participants who submitted questions in advance. One of the ones that we received applies really well here, so I'd love to read that to you. How do we engage with students who give political arguments that may resonate with dog whistles or other social identity markers that make other students in the audience feel unsafe or harassed? For example, if a student gives an argument against affirmative action and makes broad claims that, quote, social identity such as race and gender doesn't really matter because it's ability that matters. Where do we move forward? So I'm going to take that and try to wind that into my discussion. Slide. So number 1, quickly pause the conversation after you've heard biased, disturbing, or offensive word or comment from a student with something like the words, excuse me, to let the speaker know that you're interested in learning more about something they just said. So to respond to the submitted question about affirmative action, maybe saying to the student, so wait a second, I'm interested in hearing more about the statement you just made about affirmative action. So making sure to keep your focus on the student or students who verbalize the offensive language or the biased comment. And I would say most importantly, at this juncture, we must be willing to shift from our scheduled teaching plan for the sake of learning. Sometimes it seems like a huge inconvenience. I've worked with many faculty colleagues who bring a time schedule up as a reason not to tackle something awkward or biased in their classroom. But to me, I think we need to be willing to throw timing to the wind where we can have some of these important conversations and interrupt bias. So slide. Number 2 is asking the speaker for clarification. really letting the speaker know what you think you heard them say. To respond to the affirmative action question, I might respond, what I think I hear you saying is that in terms of affirmative action, social identity such as race or gender doesn't really matter that much because it's ability that matters. Is that in fact what you're saying? So what does this do? It returns the power in the situation back to the student who offered the comment, but it also gives them a minute to gather their thoughts, and it also gives them the floor to more clearly explain their language or the intent of the comment. And sometimes hearing their words resonating back makes them rethink the way that they actually made that statement. So step 3, slide, is listen carefully to the response in an engaged manner, giving the speaker an opportunity to correct your interpretation or apologize for offensive language. Making sure to use eye contact is really important in step 3. And as hard as this is, and this is something that's very challenging for me as a teacher, but interrupting the speaker only to clarify what they're saying. So in reference to the example again about affirmative action, this might be a time to clarify with the student if they are speaking from their own experience, asking them that, is this your own experience with affirmative action? And if it's not, this is a great time to explain how broad claims are not really a part of academic discourse. Step 4. Step 4 is to confidently describe what your objection was to what was said. And I think it's important to note that it's your objection that you're describing. So in reference again to the example of the submitted question, I would say to the student, I want to explain to you why the language you used was off-putting to me. And then within my comfort level, I share my own experiences or learning related to this particular situation. So I would say describing your objection can also be used for bias or offensive terms. And students often are moved to consider other perspectives, I've found, when they hear personal experiences of their professors and their mentors. And finally, the last stage is number 5, to follow up. And if there is a student or a group who was offended or potentially offended, and I think this is a really important piece, and it's often left out of training on interrupting bias. So I like personally to reach out to, by conversation, by email, to a student or students who I feel may have been off-put or affected by what was said in class. I'd like to ask their opinion about how I handled this situation in the class, how they felt at that moment in time, and how they're feeling now. It can have a significant and positive impact, this reach out, especially with students who often feel marginalized or have felt marginalized in our classes. And I think it can really be a great learning tool for us as faculty as well, as we grow and as we change. So I'm going to turn the next section over to Lara.
Which is decreasing barriers to learning through universal design. And so much of this is a system that's interwoven. For example, following up about your observations about a person's experience with the course is a great universal design tool. For example, a student who's expressed to you at the beginning of the course when they submit their information about accommodations, what it is they need, or a student who was having a challenge in a tough conversation. That follow-up and checking in is a great accessibility tool. So why do I have universal design for learning in a University of California Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement presentation? Because I think our ability to be in a community together is really strongly affected by any barriers to our participation. So universal design is simply the idea that your class is as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. And that can be particularly resonant right now as we're aware of new forms of inaccessibility. So here are my basic pieces of advice that I'll march through. Recognize the many types of accessibility and inequity, be user-friendly, leverage the best parts of the online experience, expand the definition of participate, tie assignments and their modalities to learning objectives, offer alternative modes of assessment, and involve students in accessibility. So first, recognize many types of inaccessibility. I hear a lot of a deficit model of applied to online learning, as if what's happened is that we had inclusive, accessible, and available classrooms before, and now we're suddenly challenged by, for example, the digital divide or privacy issues that come with online learning. But the fact of the matter is, this is a great opportunity to consider that our classrooms were inaccessible before in many ways, and think about the things that we're learning to do now that are remedying that. Now, one of the types of inaccessibility that I think is important to this conversation is the extent to which requiring your students to utilize their video feed has an unequal impact on students. It's about privacy in the household, students who might have had problems with, for example, assault by other students and do not want them seeing, for example, their bedroom. So recognize, if you can, as you're designing your online spaces, some of these ways in which online education is unequally and differently inaccessible. Second, be user-friendly. In addition to teaching online, I'm a parent of a high school student, and one of the things that I found last year was that District of Columbia Public Schools seemed to have recruited everyone they'd ever met to email students as many times as possible, all across the week. And I actually got a sense of what the user end of education would be like, just being copied on all of my son's emails. It is extraordinarily hard to leverage our executive function in this time, even as adults who are used to it. And for our students, it's incredibly hard, and more so for the students who have accommodations for example, visual processing or attention deficit. So this semester, I should have done it all along, and I will do it forevermore. I've actually created a timeline and checklist of everything that my students have to do for me, at least in my first year class. And this will resonate with Andrea, because in our book, How to College, we talk about having students create an assessment timeline and a calendar of everything that will be due. But I'm just laying it out in front of them. They don't have to hunt and peck through the syllabus for deadlines. Leverage the best parts of the online experience. I realized for the first time last spring that an asynchronous class was actually turning out to be easier for one of my students who celebrated Ramadan. And the capacity to study when she needed to and when she had ceased fasting was really helpful to her. So I think it can be important, again, both to accessibility and to building our communities, to actually continue to note to our students that we are trying to draw upon what's good in online learning, such as that it might be accessible to people engaged in religious observances or who used to have really bad commutes. As I mentioned in the first segment of this presentation, expand the definition of participate. Here, I'm just pointing out that for students for whom English is not their first language, for neurodiverse students, offering different ways to participate, whether through the chat function, apart from, for example, just speaking up, can increase universality of design. And that's where our Blackboard or learning management system discussion boards can also be really helpful for students who might take longer to formulate their thoughts. Tie assessments and their modalities to learning objectives. I love learning objectives. So this is the difference between a mindset of where we're making accommodations for students who can't cut it as we've designed our class, and designing our class universally such that we're only asking students to do things that actually serve the purpose of being in the course at all. So an accommodation mindset question would be, should students be allowed to take their quiz untimed or at alternative times just because we're distance learning? But if we're designing our courses universally, we would ask, well, what learning objective does having everyone take the quiz at the same time and with a timer serve? Is my class a class about speed reading law, or is my class just a class about law? And if it's the latter, you know, maybe some of the restrictions and modalities of assessment that I was using aren't actually necessary to this learning experience. And I think, as we've all learned, when we're online, that rigidity is unequally burdensome on our students as well. Offer alternative modes of assessment. We're all Zoom fatigued. We're all text fatigued. We have a lot of emails. We have a lot of writing that we're doing. I love Blackboard discussion fora. And at the same time, I'm conscious that in this modality, we're asking for more writing. So I offer my students the opportunity to submit assignments as videos. I do require them to caption them because I want them to practice what we're all preaching and make universally accessible materials. But there are many modes of captioning that are very easy and free for students to use. I offer face-to-face oral exams and quizzes for students who want them. And the idea is just, again, not to ask them to do things because it's the way you've always done them, but in ways that will sort of ease the burden, the mental burden of all of the text and all of the reading that we're doing. And finally, involve students in accessibility. I've actually been doing this since long before we were online. I have students sign up to be a note taker in my classes and submit their notes as a Google Doc on a Google Doc where they sign up. That means that there's always someone taking notes, and I say that no student should do it more than 3 times in a semester, and I don't give extra credit for doing it because it's actually not accessible to everyone to be the note taker. But there are people who are great note takers, and the reason that I've done this even before we were online is that if you know that there are notes available to you, you can just focus on listening to the class, listening to your peers, being a part of it, and knowing that somebody's writing down the key points for later. And it's also great for, again, people who miss out now that we're online, people who miss out for everything from religious observances and illnesses to Wi-Fi failures. And this ties back to our point about building community. Involving students in accessibility means that they understand that, that it's a great idea to give a little bit of yourself so that everyone in the community is on a level playing field.
Okay, so I'm going to take over now and talk a little bit about creating online spaces for student support during the pandemic. And this is our 4th of 4 themes. Slide. So during this time of virtual teaching, I think we need to ask ourselves if we have really expanded our definition of student success in our classes. And Lara certainly mentioned some of this. Has this student success descriptor changed for us since the start of the pandemic? Are we simply looking at our students' assignments and participation in class discussions to assess them, or have we added another assessment of success that maybe relates to effort or maybe even adaptability in these challenging times? And is it our place to do so? And we may have differing opinions on that. But I personally think in addition to transmitting content knowledge, this challenging time is really an opportunity for us as faculty and as staff to give to our students, give more to our students, give them something, and knowing that they are taking classes virtually. Perhaps this means going above and beyond on our syllabi, as Lara just demonstrated. Maybe it means creative ways to connect students in small class discussions or smaller video conference meetings with professionals in the field. Perhaps it includes working on our students to hone their speaking and their listening skills on Zoom. That's a wonderful professional skill they can gain during this time. And maybe also, as Lara mentioned, engaging them in their own assessments. But let's be honest, at this challenging time, faculty and staff who are working from home right now, we are battling everything from illness in our families to financial loss or anxiety, and certainly many people are juggling homeschooling of young children, and they might be totally tapped out. So do we even have the energy to go above and beyond to connect with our students on a personal level? So what I want to present to you, slide, are some doable ways to support our students through online interaction. Okay, so the first one, slide, is listening deeply when others speak. And this is free and relatively easy to do. So I really believe that we should be teaching our students what active listening means in a college setting. College students who listen thoughtfully to their peers, even during online classes, can really strengthen collegial peer relationships. And they can also grow to appreciate how their classmates are approaching the course that they're taking in a totally different manner than they do. Students who are trained to listen to their classmates create a place where they can feel safe to share their opinions and offer suggestions, often in an environment that is hopefully built on trust. So as instructors, I really believe we should model thoughtful listening for our students. Explaining maybe one of the greatest barriers to communication is listening to reply rather than listening to understand. And that's something even as adults we battle with. Modeling thoughtful listening in class, especially virtually, is not always an easy task, excuse me. It takes effort for college students to sort of quiet their own thoughts. And that's really particularly hard for first-year students, many whom did not have a particularly positive online high school experience. So it's important to remind our students of the appreciation and respect that we all feel when we are heard without distractions. So the next one is respecting silence. So silence is critical both as a teaching technique and as a mechanism to allow students the opportunity to process new information and gather their own thoughts and opinions. So lots of professors report that silence is even more ominous over Zoom than it is in a classroom setting. Some students are more focused on actively participating in class discussions than they are in listening to others. And in addition, quieter students often, I find, prematurely accept the ideas of their more extroverted peers before considering their own. So professors are sometimes concerned about wasting precious class time in silence for students to gather their thoughts. And others feel that even a few minutes of wasted time in a classroom feels like an eternity. But short silences, we have found, especially following the presentation of difficult material or maybe a hot button moment in class, is a tool that's used by many seasoned educators. And simply stating something like, let's take 2 minutes to think or write silently, and then we'll either break into class discussion, small groups, large class discussion, whatever, will often generate richer dialogue. So really giving a little bit of time for that silence. The next one is identifying needed improvements in our teaching. And this is something a lot of faculty struggle with, including myself. So regularly asking our students for feedback in writing and in person about their virtual learning experiences is really important. So they can benefit from the class, but also so we can grow as educators. And this is especially important as we experiment and sometimes as we fail with new creative ways to interact with our students virtually. But by finding out what activities work for our students and what teaching methods work for our students, we also find out a lot about ourselves, as well as learning about our students as learners. So for example, a mistake that many faculty members make is to routinely lecture through an entire online class meeting. The intent is, of course, a positive one. I'm going to jam as much important information as possible into the short time I have with our students. But if we receive feedback from our students about too many lecture-heavy classes, perhaps we should be questioning our own techniques. You know, how will our students really understand the material if all they have done is listen? And that's something that we need to think about. So most typically, instructor evaluations are done at the end of a semester, which leaves little room for improvement during the course of that semester. So asking for students for regular feedback throughout the semester, we're always able to troubleshoot and to change things on a dime and maybe pivot to a different type of online teaching technique. Many of our online learning platforms offer these assessments for quick check-ins. So sometimes in this particular situation, I would say a virtual classroom experience is an easier way to give these quick time assessments. And this way we can continue to adjust our instruction to better meet the needs of our students. Next slide. So this is a really important one, which is called recognizing the humanity of each other. And I've been talking about this a lot, especially with high school students. So taking time to connect with our students on a personal and an emotional level will show them that they're valued and they're worthy. We all know that. But to the extent that we are comfortable, it's really powerful that we share both challenging and joyous stories from our own lives with them. So it would be great if we could feel comfortable letting our students know what's important to us, not just as educators, but as people, maybe even as caretakers, who are living with the uncertainties of this pandemic. So as students have more restricted or no contact at all with their physical institutions, colleges face the challenge of helping students build relationships with faculty and staff, not just as educators, but on this human level, and it's much easier to do in person. So using students' chosen names pronounced correctly, regardless of how challenging those might be, using their preferred pronouns, acknowledging stressful times in their lives, acknowledging stressful times on campus, especially when campuses have to close or pivot, or in the larger society, such as the election, asking how our students are feeling after they've been sick or after they've been taking care of a sick family member, sending a quick note to express concern if their behavior in a Zoom class seems off to you. They're all crucial to building trust, and they're all just little things that we can do that make a really big difference for this humanity piece. I've seen faculty and staff offering new personal touches with very human messages on their syllabi and student trainings before launching into details about the structure and talking points in a class. For example, here's one I loved from a fellow colleague. This is a tough time and no one signed up for this. Not the fear of sickness, not the social distancing, and not for the typical collective experience of our lives, and especially your lives as college students on campus. So in this semester, we are going to prioritize supporting each other's humanity. That was in a faculty member syllabus. I just thought it was brilliant. So for my last slide, I want to talk a little bit about remembering that the private has become public through virtual learning, and that's going to lead to my last point. So with the exception of asynchronous learning, students are seeing, as Lara mentioned before, into their peers and into our homes really for the first time. They're not actually entering our class anymore on seemingly equal playing fields from similar residence halls, right, where they're all complaining about the same thing. And of course, with this comes the inequality, the embarrassments, the noises outside of their control, unpredictable internet service, pulls of family responsibility, including taking care of siblings. Students are reporting how they actually are judging the homes of their professors and of their classmates, and they worry about their own environments being judged as well. So it's a new frontier, and it's one as educators we need to take into account and allow our students to voice concern about. So even just asking our students if they're finding their current living environment challenging for the virtual classroom, that is a really wonderful start. And then for my final point, familiarizing ourselves with support services offered through our campus this fall. And this is something that's quick and easy for us to do and just makes us even better professors. So, excuse me. So for the most part, our students in the past have really been able to navigate these two separate worlds, right? Their worlds inside our classroom and their worlds on campus outside of our classroom. Before the pandemic, our students, for example, spend many hours each week in an academic class, but then they also spend time with the advisor of their music group or their residence hall staff, their academic advisor, their campus chaplain, their sports coach, their mental health counselor. So each one of those mentors, in addition to their faculty members, are this incredibly important part of the college students' growth and development. But many of those frontline staff members are now not able to have regular opportunities to engage with students because of the pandemic. And it's interesting to think about it, but as faculty members, we're actually, in many situations, the constants in our students' lives, where in the past, staff members have been. So we should be prepared to find our students needier this fall as they search for the adult mentors that they hope to find on their college campuses. But even on campuses where learning takes place completely virtually, as faculty, we should educate ourselves to know whom those staff members are who are working on our campus and what their availability looks like virtually this semester. So for example, is the Dean of Students office holding virtual office hours? Is that something you know about your campus? Is the counseling center open this semester for emergency visits only, or maybe there are virtual sessions and support groups that we can suggest to our students if they're in need? Are there online musical performances or guest lectures that are still coming to our campus that we can let our students know about? Are academic tutors still available virtually? How is disability support working? Is that something that we know as faculty? Are students finding friends through shared Zoom club meetings? The more we know, I'd say, the more we can share with our students. And that not only helps them to engage with our campus, but it also helps them to find resources outside of what we're able to help them with that can really help them thrive in this challenging fall. So that is the end of my piece. So right back to you, Michelle.
Actually, if you are both open to it, there's a couple of Q's and questions there. If you want to go ahead and take them.
I realized the way that I was screen sharing, I didn't see that they were there until we were sort of underway. But I want to read one. Is it appropriate for any particular event or a heads up in the syllabus that in the event that such a situation arises that I'll jump in for clarification, and then we can continue the discussion separately in a way that makes the situation more productive? So I'm actually not sure I understand.
My guess is that's about hot button moments. So I'm gonna respond that way, if that's okay. So you know, that's completely your prerogative to do that. And if that makes you more comfortable, absolutely. I would be a little nervous about putting in a syllabus that I wouldn't want other students to have the opportunity to respond, because I do want that open dialogue in my classes. But maybe there could be language that assures a student that I will be there to jump in and that I do know how to respond to the situation. So, sort of halfway between that question and the other, which is I might put in my syllabus that I've got your back, I am your ally, I will be there to respond, but I would not want to shut down any other students having the opportunity to also voice their objections. Lara, do you want to add anything?
One of the things about that is I think in the groundwork laying portion of our semester, I actually do have conversations with students about the roles of professors and students. And I think this is particularly important for first year students. And we talk about the extent to which there's an obligation or a necessity in the classroom to provide a certain kind of balance. Is it the student's job? If you're in a class where one person is an outlier in their ideology or in their identity, what role do they see as right for professors, for colleagues, for classmates, for the university itself in either interrupting bias or balancing, in some cases, the bubble? And so the hope is that we have come to some shared values around that in advance, so that when a hot moment comes, as it might, it comes in the context of people having agreed to an extent on what the right amount of engagement in a class is, including some students who feel strongly about interrupting bias, also feel strongly about getting to content. Because one of the things that students have told me, and this has been particularly the case with Black students in this really emotionally resonant year, we'll put it, it's not necessarily a given that students want every one of their classrooms to be about the same subject matter. And in fact, they might be finding that your class itself is an interruption of the really triggering and problematic dynamics of outside of the class. So getting some sense even in that balance of how much space this other part of the work will take with student buy-in. And students actually tend to agree with one another about those kinds of things fairly well, even when they're ideologically at odds.
I want to make sure that everyone can see there have been some other questions that have been posed and then answered by the panelists. So make sure people can all check that. And I just want to give a final opportunity if people want to jump in either to the chat or the Q&A to direct any comments or questions at Lara and Andrea. I always find their wisdom to be exceptional and take copious notes and give people like another moment. And if there aren't any other chats, that's nice. Thank you for that nice note. It seems like people are kind of ready to wrap up, and I think that's great. And I just, of course, want to thank Lara and Andrea for their time and for sharing their insights, and let people know that we have additional upcoming workshops. The next one is 2 weeks from today. It's called Sex Talk Toolkit. It's a workshop for classroom interaction. CSU Long Beach professor and former fellow Shira Tarrant created an online resource designed to promote free speech and data-driven dialogue about sex and politics. And her workshop is going to introduce participants to the resource and discuss how to integrate that into classroom conversation and university coursework. I think it will be fascinating. So I encourage you to join us for this or for others. And I'll just say thank you, and we'll sign off. Everyone have a good rest of your week. Stay healthy, stay well.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.